Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar MaaS and Young People, and it's great to have you all here. We still see some attendees coming into the webinar, so we'll just start with the introduction of the topic and also of our panelists, and then we'll dive into the discussion. You can also ask questions in between in the little question box that you should see on your GoToWebinar panel, and you'll also get a recording of this session in case you have to leave earlier. So welcome everyone, thanks for joining us. This webinar is run by the MaaS Alliance, and if you don't know the MaaS Alliance yet, it's a really great organization that brings together stakeholders in the mobility as a service sector, and by now has, I think, over 100 members from both the private and the public sector. And you can find out more about the MaaS Alliance on their website, that is maas-alliance.eu. And as part of the work that the MaaS Alliance does, this webinar is part of a working group called Users and Rights, and we do lots of work on regulatory aspects of MaaS, things like insurance, but also the user aspect. So we talk a lot about inclusion and accessibility. We did a past webinar on inclusion in terms of gender and accessible mobility as a service. And today we're talking about a really interesting audience that isn't mentioned too often, but is really crucial to the success of not just MaaS, but mobility in general, and that is young people. So by young people, I mean Gen Z and younger. And I'm really excited to have a really great panel here today of experts. Some of them have done some really interesting research on the topic, and others have run very interesting projects as well. And yeah, there's a whole host of knowledge on mobility as a service, but also on our audience of younger people. So we'll dive straight in. There won't be any slides today, but just pure discussion. And yeah, as I said, feel free to ask questions and we'll try to answer them throughout the session. So I'd like to introduce the first panelist. That's Dr. Romana Islam-Sarkar, and she is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Innsbruck in beautiful Austria. Welcome, Romana. Romana has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and also a master's degree in transportation systems, and she currently works at the Unit for Intelligent Transport Systems at the University of Innsbruck. And she's done some really fascinating research on young people and mobility as a service that hasn't been published yet. So we're very privileged to get a sneak peek into that research, and we'll hear more about that very soon. And our next speaker is Audrey Dennis. She's a strategy manager at Cubic and located in Washington, DC. Cubic does a lot of work in the mobility as a service space from a sort of commercial side. Audrey is a New York City native and she's never learned to drive. So there you go, we'll get a whole different perspective on mobility as a service from someone who does not use a car. And also she'll be able to give some insights on the North American aspect of our topic. Our next panelist is Dr. David Golightly, Senior Research Associate at the Future Mobility Group at the University in Newcastle. And David has co-authored a really interesting paper on young people and mobility as a service. And by young people, he went as young as 8 years old, I think, and found that while some of the young people have the same concerns as adults when it comes to mobility as a service, they also have their own very specific needs. And it will be fascinating to hear about what he found out in his research. And then last but not least, we've got Phil Nutley. Hi, Phil, from Brighton here in the UK. Phil is the head of experience design at CCD Design and Ergonomics. and he's got a wealth of experience in the design area, and he also teaches at the Royal College of Arts amongst other schools and colleges. And I think we'll start with you, Phil. You're our big picture person, because you've got such a broad overview over this audience, not just from a MaaS perspective, but mobility in general, I guess. So do you want to start by talking about who are these young people we want to discuss today, and what makes Gen Z and even younger kids different to other generations, especially in regards to mobility?
Yes, thank you. Firstly, thanks for the invite. Really looking forward to the discussion today. I suppose I'll just set the context a little bit. CCD's very interested in kind of multimodal experiences, and I suppose looking at the value in the parallels between the different sectors that we work in, so rail, aviation, and future of transport. We're also interested in the accessibility and those kind of shared lived experiences across different demographics. And I suppose I personally come to this interested in how design and creativity is a kind of connector. You know, design is for everyone, you know, that kind of creative process. But I think as we've all agreed, getting young people, young adults involved earlier, particularly in the planning of transport and mobility hubs and services and products is key. I think also asking the right questions and observing how they use these services or want to use them, I think is fundamental. And I'm really looking forward to what Romana, David and Audrey have to say. I'm also personally interested in the way young people develop their own language and vernacular around hacks and social content and products, particularly mobility. We're seeing a lot more e-scooters being used, particularly food service deliveries, either being delivered or going out there and earning their own money with that. Certainly the kind of wider cultural context and the behaviours in our kind of post-COVID-19 world, I suppose. You know, even on a personal level, I have 2 teenagers at home, and I'm beginning to see how they're starting to establish their habits that could last for decades. And whilst, you know, we're beginning to see more walking, use of buses, e-scooting, like I've said, you know, there's certainly been a rise, a sharp rise in the UK here. You know, I also have concerns around potentially beginning to see an upsurge in car use. I know there's no recent data, and you know, kind of pre-COVID, we were obviously beginning to see a lot of young people not take here in the UK the kind of driving tests. But I do think that there's an opportunity here to involve young people in the wider context of MaaS and the benefits to using a kind of broader set of mobility services and tools. And I suppose I'd like to start with talking about the value and the non-monetary value. I think we've often, you know, we see young people and young adults and their value in our society as being something that's quite financial, taxpayers. And I think a lot of young people are not being heard or not involved because they are seen as non-taxpayers. And there was a lovely piece of research that came out of the Grosvenor group. We know here in the UK that 25% of the population is young people, but we're missing a massive opportunity because they're being routinely left out of discussions about the future of neighbourhoods. And actually some of the research that they published showed that 89% of young adults aged 16 to 18 have never been asked their opinion about their neighbourhood, and that only, you know, a lowly 8% have taken part in any kind of public consultation. So there's a huge opportunity that we're missing out, not involving young people earlier in the process. I think if we look at the future of education, super interesting. I think the demand that has on their time, money, and the debt that they incur. I think we're also beginning to see what's happening with COVID and how they're being, you know, stuck or isolated, socially isolated, having to be away from home. And the rise in popularity of online courses, Open University, MOOCs, digital courses. And also that young people are missing out on that face-to-face time, you know, project-based or peer-based learning, coupled alongside, you know, how people might move in the future to courses or further education courses, and what MaaS means in that kind of realm of further educational areas. Also, there's a big shift in which we're seeing of urban to rural shifts. So, you know, a lot of disruption around people moving home or wanting to move to places where there's more outdoor spaces or access to more outdoor space. Also, the mental well-being, like I said, you know, personally, I've got 2 teenagers at home. During the first lockdown, that lack of being able to meet and see friends, I think, has been important. And you know, that independence, which they don't potentially have through, you know, someone like myself or other parents giving them, you know, asking parents for lifts. I definitely think there's room for growth around that first and last mile, and the anxiety that has, and dependencies that young people have. Actually very similar for another demographic, which are older generations. You know, they both will depend more and more on parents giving them lifts. The anxiety of finding face-to-face contacts within transport hubs and nodes. You know, outside of the UK, I've also spent time in Brazil, and interest on one of the projects that we created called Creative Campus there, was looking at how young people look at the security and the environment around mobility and feeling safe. You know, mobility is that opportunity for that kind of social connection and that glue. I wanted to kind of just talk about, obviously we're talking about young people here and how we kind of put them into user groups and age ranges. Transport Focus and GWR, so CCD, we've been working quite a lot recently within rail, looking at different demographics and the whole kind of end-to-end experience and having a more passenger focus. But the Transport Focus and GWR kind of paper divided the young people into 3 kind of different groups: 15 to 17-year-olds, who are clearly dependent on parents for travel, providing lifts and obviously paying for tickets. And there's obviously an awkwardness, isn't there, around all of that, and the conflict between, you know, parents and teenage needs. 18 to 23-year-olds who are, you know, kind of fleeing the family nest, going off to pastures new, going out to university, going to new cities, are far more financially independent or becoming more financially independent. And their confidence is growing around making kind of longer trips and journeys, either to meet friends and partners or be by themselves. And then 24 to 30-year-olds. So in many ways, very similar to our kind of adult audience, but you know, the confidence is there, but they're more concerned around the costs of these services and how do these services migrate together. So I suppose one of the last things I'll just leave us on is how do we define young? You know, is it 16 to 18? Is it 20 somethings, or dare I say it, you know, is it 30-year-olds are now too old? I'm in my 40s, so clearly way too old for this, although I did shave before this. But I think what I am interested in is obviously particularly hearing more about David's work with younger age groups, and fundamentally as a designer, how do we get them interested in MaaS sooner rather than later? So some early thoughts there.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And there's some interesting, shocking statistics that we don't ask young people about what they think, simply because they don't pay tax and they're young. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, someone who has been asking young people is Romana. And before we dive into your research, I just wanted to touch on something that you mentioned in a previous conversation. You called Innsbruck a heaven for public transport, and we always say with mobility as a service that public transport is the backbone for MaaS. So I'd love to hear why, just very briefly, why Innsbruck is so special when it comes to public transport, but also what is the purpose behind your research and why do you focus on young people?
Actually, Innsbruck is the capital of Tyrol region, that is in the western part of Austria with approximately 100,000 inhabitants. So it's a medium-sized city, but there are two operators. One operator is called EVB. They're operating in the core Innsbruck zone, and then the regional operators, they're collaborating with EVB, and they're operating in suburban areas with more than 200 lines. So it's a medium city, and it's easy to handle probably, but apart from the research that I'm going to present today, we have conducted a survey in 2017 about service disruption and complaining behavior. And 80% of the participants say that they're very happy with the public transport system, and they think that operators are efficient to provide high quality transit. Regarding the disruptions, only 20% of the respondents say that they have sometimes experienced missed connection lines. So this is not very often, this is just sometimes. And the sample, it was only 24% of the respondents, they were solely using public transport. So there was sufficient multimodal trips. So it was not like that you are bound to use public transport. That's why you were saying it's a high quality public transport. And these results are also in agreement with the official survey that was conducted by the operators. So the customers were happy, but they were not happy with the price. So in 2017, they have reformed this tariff structure. So now in the whole Tyrol region, you can travel the whole Tyrol region by paying 42 euro per month. So more specifically, it's just 1.5 euro per day, which is really cheap comparing the quality. And one surprising fact that I've got to know from the operator, that this year, the sale of this yearly ticket went up to 45% during this pandemic, where in most of the cities, public transport was highly affected. We have heard about it. So 100% satisfaction is not easy to achieve, but somehow the operators in Innsbruck, they have managed to gain this customer loyalty, and they are willing to have more facilities for their users. Personally, like Audrey, I also never learned to drive. And as a public transport enthusiast, I don't want to. And during my lifestyle changes and after having baby, I still can assure myself that as long as I'm staying in Innsbruck, probably I can keep my promise.
Nice.
So, and now there might be question that if public transport is so dreamy in Innsbruck, then what we are trying to achieve through our research. So the operators are really interested in a specific user group, that is the young user group, mainly students, because they have a reduced fare for the young transit users in the form of semester tickets, and which is also one of the most popular tickets that they sell. Probably this semester ticket is now paid by their parents of the students because they might income, but their income might be lower. So maybe parents are paying, but when they will graduate and when they will have the ability to buy their own car, will they still stay with public transport? That's why public transport operators are thinking maybe only public transport is not enough to retain this user group. They also, in their official survey, they have asked, like, do you see any reduction in your future transit use? And then 30% of the respondents between the age of 18 and 29, they say that, yes, they might change to another mode. So that's why through our research, we wanted to understand what is the potential of MaaS to retain this group of riders. The public transport operators, they already have their own bike sharing scheme. They have also recently collaborated with the car sharing scheme, but we wanted to see what's the potential of MaaS from this specific user group.
Okay, that's really interesting. It's very forward thinking, isn't it? To look at how we can retain this audience for the future, and what are the pain points. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then David, you co-authored a really interesting paper about mobility as a service and younger generations. And you look at children as young as 8 years old. How do they consume mobility services, and why do we need to consider them for mobility as a service?
Thanks, Sandra. I mean, first of all, thanks very much for organising this. I think, you know, Phil highlighted it at the beginning. It's such an overlooked area, and you know, we need to consider at all ages and all different types of children and young people to understand how they're travelling now, but also how they're going to travel in the future. So I think having this kind of opportunity to discuss it, I think is very important. Yes, we did look in the work that we wrote up in the paper. We had children who were 16, 17, 18, or young people 16, 17, 18, more like tweens, 11, 12, 13, but we did have some 6, 7, 8-year-olds as well in there. And they do consume you, but I mean, it's interesting you use that term. They do consume mobility, but I guess the key thing for them is they consume mobility in a collaborative manner. And primarily that is through their parents and caregivers. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are just bundled into a car or a bus or taken somewhere. They quite often have a say in what that mobility is. They're going to school, but they're also going to social events, parties, sport, a lot of them in things like sporting and other types of, after school activities as well. So they do have a role in selecting where the destinations are, if you like, but they do it very much in a collaborative manner. But I think the most important thing as well is that even the children who we spoke to at that age, that they're forming very strong impressions about what they like and dislike and what they're experiencing and what their aspirations are about travel and mobility. I mean, if I use an example from myself, my daughter, when she was about 4 or 5, we took a trip on the Eurostar, and it was off peak, so we were able to get a kind of a business class ticket for it, which was great because as we were sitting there, we were offered lunch, and the stewardess on the train came up to my daughter and said, well, would you like a drink? And she said, well, I like a hot chocolate. I went off and made her a hot chocolate. And even now, my daughter, it's years ago, my daughter still talks about what a great experience it was. She loved that train journey. So we were able to create the staff were able to create something that was really interesting and positive. And I guess what we get to is, particularly public transport, mobility as a service should be aspirational. It should be something that we're encouraging people to do. It's a positive experience for them. And therefore understanding their needs and what really resonates with them. If we can do that at an early stage and get them on board early, we'll be able to make sure they buy into public transport and MaaS. And that will somewhat counter what we found in our study. There's still quite a lot of aspiration for people to get a private car. And I still think there's a concern that we need to counter that and make sure public transport is something that's aspirational and accessible.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, David. And then Audrey, so you are bringing in the sort of North American US perspective, and obviously the transport landscape looks quite different in the US, with a lot of cities not having very well funded public transport, with active travel not really something that is encouraged or possible in terms of the infrastructure. How does that impact Gen Z when those younger generations might not do their driver's license? Do they have similar expectations towards mobility compared to young people in Europe, do you think?
Yeah, so as a young person living in the United States, I've always lived in cities, like you were saying, Sandra. I grew up in New York City and now live in Washington, D.C., and I don't drive. So glad, Romana, to hear that I'm not alone. And I think that is becoming a more prevalent preference and experience for people and young people living in the United States. And I think there are preferences that are changing for young people that are very different from the generations that came before us, but we're still very much stuck on our parents' transportation systems. And those preferences take a few different bends. One of those is urban living. So like myself, living in cities, we see that from a recent study from the Journal of Regional Science that young people are the growth engine behind urban growth in the United States. And on top of that, that public transit is a big determinant of where people ages 22 to 44 choose to live. So there's definitely a preference for some urban and suburban living. And then beyond that, there's a huge care for the environment among this generation. We see that 80% of voters ages 18 to 29 in the 2020 election said that climate change was a major threat. So that is top of mind for how this generation is making choices. And then there is a preference for less driving. As I was doing some research on this topic, I found it really interesting. I found a study from WIS PRG Foundation that found that 55% of students in Wisconsin said that they would be more likely to live in Wisconsin after they graduated from college if they were able to live without needing to drive to work or to run errands. So it's a really interesting consideration, and I think that that is echoed nationally. There was a study from Arity that found that over half of millennials say they'd rather be doing something more productive than driving. So catching up with friends or working or reading a book, and that their cars aren't worth the cost of upkeep, but only 13% say that they can really live without a car. So there's a fundamental mismatch, which is that there's a generation that wants to live in cities, that wants to have options that aren't single occupancy vehicles, but those options don't necessarily exist. And that's where I think this mobility as a service conversation really comes in a few different ways. So one of those is that this is a generation of digital natives who are very used to interacting with the world through apps and mobile devices. So how do we make mobility as a service a really seamless experience that sort of incorporates technologies that we're all very accustomed to? So an example of that is Cubic has rolled out the capability in New York City to pay for the subway using smartphones and smart devices, and we've seen that now 10% of all subway swipes are using smartphones and smart devices and credit cards. So how do we change the way that we pay to make it easier and incorporate young people through those types of experiences? And then I think as we go through the process of digitizing and digital mobility of the city, we collect a ton of data that allows us to understand how users are using the network and traveling and multimodal linkages. And that, I think, really needs to be part of the conversation of understanding how young people are putting demand on the system and how their journeys are shaping out. And that helps us to think through planning mobility hubs, changing the public transit network, standing up flexible options. And then for areas that don't have accessible or comprehensive public transit networks, how do we think about shared vehicles so that there really is a mobility as a service infrastructure that allows users to replace single occupancy vehicles? And then there's a final piece that I think is interesting. I think we're all very used to a loyalty experience where we receive rewards for example, for coffee, you buy 9 coffees and you get the 10th for free. So how do we bring that type of experience that builds loyalty in the mobility as a service network? So something that Cubic has done in Miami is rolled out the ability for Miami-Dade to schedule campaigns that rewards users for traveling at off-peak times so that they're reducing congestion on the network, as well as returning to public transit. But I think the opportunity with incentives is somewhat limitless in terms of how we engage the public, young people, thinking about how we reward loyalty, create more seamless journeys by encouraging multimodal shifts when there are disruptions or there is congestion on a certain network. So I think as we think about mobility as a service and young people really thinking about how we make it seamless and how we develop an ecosystem that makes it viable to not have to rely on single occupancy vehicles.
Sounds easy, right?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you, Audrey. That was really interesting. And yeah, now let's dive into the research results from Romana and David. And just to answer the first question from James here, he's asking if the papers can be made available. David's paper is already available online, and Romana's, I think, is coming out next year. So keep an eye out on maybe the MaaS Alliance LinkedIn page, or connect with me on LinkedIn and I can share that with you as well. So Romana, what have you actually found out in your research?
Okay, so actually this research was part of my doctoral project, and I did collaborate with the public transport operator. So we wanted to know if transit users or public transport users are willing to replace their current ticket option to MaaS. So it was a steady preference survey. We did it online and also on board in the public transport, buses, trains, and subways. And we also presented a hypothetical app-based service with 2 different service bundles along with the current ticket option, and the respondents had to choose one alternatives. Unfortunately, not many of the respondents chose MaaS, so only 1/3 of the respondents were willing to use MaaS instead of their current subscription. However, within this limited switching intention, young users were more likely to choose MaaS between the age of 18 to 20 years old. But we have also found that public transport ticket actually increased the attractiveness of the MaaS. However, the package price should be planned very cost effectively, because what we've seen, the higher the price is than their current transit ticket, people are less likely to switch to MaaS. Also, additional free minutes in bike sharing rides and discounts on the cost-based cost of car sharing system has positive influence. But I've also found that people with pro-car, pro-cycling attitudes and also need for more mode flexibility, as well as taste for innovative solutions, they were more likely to choose MaaS. We have also asked about the advantages and disadvantages of the MaaS from participants' point of view. So a simplified payment option was the most agreed advantage. However, there are concerns related to data privacy and sufficient availability of the fleet. One of the counterintuitive results that we found that there is a negative association between MaaS and pro-environmental travelers. Usually it's often said that MaaS can induce more conventional car use, but we've tried it because in our package it was an electric car sharing system, but this was very new at the time of the study. So maybe the full potential of this car sharing scheme was not explored. But a future recommendation about research could be to find the association between the green travelers and green fuel alternatives in MaaS. Now, one might think that in a city like Innsbruck, where there is high quality public transport, MaaS might be still too ambitious. But what we found that promotion matters. So there was a minimal experience with the already existing shared services. So if we can promote this type of services to the users, and if you can understand if these services caters their daily need, then we can carefully plan service bundles, keeping in mind the specific focus group that is young users, and then it will be more successful and more appealing to the public transport users. So these were the highlights of my work, but the result is still going on. We're still doing the estimation, so probably we can get some more interesting results out of it.
Okay, that's great. That's really fascinating. It also aligns with what Audrey mentioned previously, with a sort of seamless experience, especially when it comes to payments, for example. That's yeah, interesting results there. And David, is that something you can relate to? Have you found different things, or you probably had a slightly different approach as well in your research? Oh, I can't hear you at the moment.
Okay, yeah, there's two differences. I think one is that we had younger ages included in our study as well, and also our study was more qualitative. We used focus groups. But I think also Newcastle's got some real strengths in terms of its transportation network, but it also has some acknowledged weaknesses as well. I don't think it is that kind of, you know, was it heaven? Innsbruck described it as public transportation. There's definitely pockets of what we would call transport poverty here. So places where very low car ownership and not necessarily very good access to public transport. And they were some of the areas that we targeted in our focus groups. Just to give you a bit of background, I'm working in an EU project called My Corridor, looking at MaaS across a number of countries in the EU. And just looking through the MaaS literature, there's very little appreciation of children and young people. I mean, it's really great to hear about the work that Romana's talking about, but I think historically it's been very much overlooked. And so we wanted to just reflect that and understand, you know, children are, as say, current users, but users of the future as well. What were their perceptions? And in our case, we did some focus group work to understand both how they currently traveled. And then we also use a technique. I work with some social scientists from School of Education, and they used a technique involving Lego allowed people to kind of visualize what they wanted from transport systems, but also to kind of express their concerns. I mean, this works well with older children. Actually, you can use it with adults as well. And that allowed them to kind of visualize and verbalize their concerns. So we're asking them about what they thought about travel currently, giving them a description of MaaS, so how they reacted to that, and then kind of try to understand what their aspirations were for the future. And I'll just get a few of the key findings up. I think the main thing was the idea that even in our group, our 3 focus groups, very diverse views depending on their age. As I said earlier, you know, very young children tend to be sort of recipients, they collaborate in their travel, but obviously as you move up towards 16 and 18, they travel very differently. They have their own needs. A lot of them are going into further education, but I think also they're moving into things like they are wanting to look at a car. I think it was interesting what you said, Audrey, that we found a similar mismatch in that even though people expressed a desire not necessarily to use a car that much, they found themselves in a situation, even in an urban environment, where they needed a car because they needed to get to work on time, they needed to get to further education on time. And so it therefore became aspirational to have a car. They certainly, all of our ages, actively thought about their travel and how they wanted to do it. And as I said earlier, they had kind of positive and negative experiences they had to draw on. And I think one thing particularly for MaaS that was interesting was the importance of public transit. Now, that's not just in terms of public transit as a multimodal, a part of a multimodal journey, but also this idea that they wanted the brand of MaaS to be a strong brand, a brand that they trusted. And in Newcastle, that brand was the Public Transit Authority. And that was because I think at all our ages, for different reasons, they had concerns about their own personal security, but they had concerns as well about vulnerability. And I think particularly as you move into sort of tweens and the concerns they had, they want to travel socially. And part of that is for camaraderie and for friendship, but also a bit of that is about protection. They had concerns about going on public transit and being exposed to, you know, threats and security and stuff like that. So that had a major bearing on how they wanted to travel. They're not concerned around IT. They are definitely digital natives, but it was surprising they did have some concerns around sort of the surveillance nature and what their data was going to be used to. So they were aware of the issues around that. But I say the car is still seen as a bit of a necessity and a status symbol. So I mean, just that, like the sort of summary of that is, you know, children and young people, they very much have an active voice. They clearly understand what they want, how they want to travel. And I think that can be represented in both the design of services, but also some considerations around policy and how those services are deployed. And I think the overriding message is that, you know, mobility is critical for independence. You know, if we think about children and young people in their life course, what are the major events? You know, learning how to walk, learning to leave the house, going to school on your own for the first time, going on your first holiday, getting a car, those kind of things. Mobility and independence are so closely interlinked. So we have to think not just about mobility, but how are we going to promote and support independence? And therefore, how does mobility fit with that? And that relates to the human-computer interaction, the design of the apps, the design of the services, and also the policy that will support the deployment of MaaS.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. We've mentioned the topic of data a few times, and you've also talked about privacy. I think, Romana, you touched on it. David, you just touched on it. And it was also a question by Andrew from the audience, who's asking, data for analytics and incentives is interesting, but how do we balance data privacy and security for user data? Or is it even an issue, as a lot of young people give up their data privacy for the use of social media? So it sounds like young people are sort of aware of the issue, but are they concerned about it? And is it an issue that would change their behavior, or is it just something they they take into account as normal. That's just a trade-off you have to do to be able to use any kind of service like mobility as a service function. Who would like to reply to that one first? Yeah,
well,
David.
as I say, I think that was part of this linking to the brand. It wasn't just the reliability of the public transport service. Around here in Newcastle, we have Nexus, TfL. They're seen as a trusted brand, a trusted organisation. It may in fact be that they're kind of, you know, public authority. So they, I think, were perceived as being not only reliable in terms of their transportation, but also how they would look after people's data. They weren't giving it to a private organisation. A second comment, though, I think is a real tension there, because I think with any aspect of using mobile services on a mobile device, children and young people are always trying to use them and access them at an earlier age than quite often they're supposed to. So I just heard a news article the other day about what age children were using social media and things like WhatsApp. You know, I think the age is 13 in the UK, but people are getting them earlier and earlier. So there's a real tension between how do you balance off the functionality that often is required at an earlier age or desired at an earlier age than necessarily the legislation strictly allows them to be using the app at.
Yeah.
I think you said something really interesting, David, around the trust in the public transport operator and that being a critical piece to successful adoption or trust in mobility as a service. And I think that that also extends into this data conversation, that the public transport operators or the custodians of data are trusted to use it for appropriate means. And I think that there are some tools that can be engaged to try to support that and make sure that data is used in a safe and appropriate way. One thing that we've done is a de-identification engine that allows us to apply hashing techniques and aggregations at different levels to make sure that PII and PCI and anything that might be sensitive or identifiable is removed from data, but the data is still useful for analytics context to try to understand movement through the network and demand and general trends. So I think just being very deliberate about data usage and de-identifying it in the context to make sure that it's safe and appropriate, while also being able to glean insights from it is a critical way for transport operators to maintain that appropriate data custodianship.
And sorry, just going back to, I wanted to pick up on Romana, what you were talking about, the more sustainable issues there. I think there's definitely that tension between mobility and independence, and the aspiration. I wonder how we could shift the behaviours and try and get more young people who are very concerned about, you know, the kind of green economy, the sustainable angle that we have within our own environments. And by getting them involved earlier in these processes, I wonder how we could turn MaaS into something far more positive. You know, most school journeys are under a few kilometres, yet, you know, how many parents put kids in cars? You know, so how we challenge and change that, and almost gamify or make it far more playful, loving you know, the Lego usage there, or the idea of getting young people involved, but then also layering in that kind of sustainable angle and the positive benefits it have on the environment around them.
I think I can add to this data privacy thing. I think public transport operators should also be more open to sharing their data to the private providers and to show their users that we are also open to data privacy. We are also sharing openly our data. Then the users will also reciprocate it. And then they will think, okay, our data is not abused. We can share our data anyway. And after, I think pre-pandemic world was different about data security. And after this pandemic, I think we are everywhere sending our data for this contact tracing things. So I think we need to rethink again what the users are now thinking about data privacy. Are they have this fear of sharing their data or not? Is it too important for them still now?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a really crucial topic, isn't it? That balancing the need for privacy with the need for data and analysing that data. And Phil, you brought up the topic of green and sustainable mobility as a service, and that's also one of the audience questions. James is asking, this environmental angle is of course a key part. Could cultural pressure inspire the development and uptake of MaaS? And how much do you think something like flight shaming might happen with private use cars? So car shaming, how does that look within that younger generation? Are they really all sort of having Greta Thunberg as a role model and are really sort of pumped up about being more environmental, and would that be something that would push them towards mobility as a service?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, in Brighton here, we're fortunate. We've elected the only Green MP, I think, in the country for several terms now. You know, schools are having cycle trains. You know, more and more visits from schools are young people walking and enjoying the environment that they're around. I'm not sure if it's about shaming always and looking at the negative side. I just think it's changing that behaviour, like David, well, everyone's spoken to from an earlier age, so it becomes the norm. You know, it's frightening when you hear that, you know, Audrey talking about how we're inheriting, you know, our behaviours from our parents' transport schemes and mechanisms and networks. You know, we've really got to start thinking about how we can rethink that service model, and the earlier we can get people into rethinking that, getting involved in it, it doesn't then become about shaming. It becomes that normal, doesn't it? You know, so I'm used to walking to school. I'm used to using a bike. Or the way I migrate from bus to bike or e-scooter is super simple. So I think it's for the policy makers here, in particular the UK. You know, we've got a green economy initiative that the government's now talking about. Well, let's see some action about it, you know, and let's start feeding that in sooner rather than later.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think then if you're going to encourage people to use a more flexible range of modes rather than just getting out of the car, and given that so much of it is set by, you know, parents, I think we have to make it easier for families to travel in that kind of really early, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. I mean, I've personally got experience again. I've taken other journeys on the train. I've been really difficult with a child, you know, logistically with push chairs and baggage and just making sure you could get a seat and all this kind of stuff. It's quite an off-putting experience. If we make it easier for families to travel, then the whole family is exposed to a range of new mobility options, which again are aspirational, and it's seen in a positive light, and then that sets up patterns for the rest of people's lives.
Yes, good point. And that leads me to another question. So what if young people do not travel with their parents? And that's another audience question as well from Julio, who's asking, what about services who can give secure MaaS to unaccompanied minors, for example, going to school or, you know, going to see their friends? How do we deal with this safety issue? And is that something that mobility as a service can answer? I don't know. Romana, do you have an opinion on that?
I probably didn't understand the question. Can you please repeat it once? The safety issue, if MaaS can answer the safety?
What about unaccompanied minors? So really young people who are traveling by themselves, and that sort of safety issue around that do you think that's something that mobility as a service can help with? And was that a concern you came across during your research?
Actually, in my research, we are focusing mainly public transport users, and here the children under 16 years old, they don't travel in the public transport. They have their specific school buses. They have their own tickets. So this is two separate groups. So I can only say, if you're above 16, I think here children are more independent, and then they can take care of their own safeties and those things. So I don't know in my context, if I have not researched this area of safety issue and MaaS, but maybe David can tell something about it.
Yeah, if I can give a politician's answer by slightly changing the question. I think the key thing there is that minors don't necessarily travel unaccompanied, but what they do is they travel socially. So we get a lot of school children, people going to sports clubs, get the metro and the buses around here. And what they do is they organise themselves so that they travel together in groups of 3. Not in a very complex manner, but it's just, oh, I'll get the same train as you at 4:15, things like that. And that's how they get around the issue of being accompanied by an adult. It's because they travel in groups. So I think a really important thing for MaaS, for that kind of age group up to, really independent travel, 16, 17 and above, so younger than that, is being able to orchestrate social travel. How do I organize a journey so that I can also travel with my friends? Because if I can organize that kind of social journey, that all of a sudden becomes a lot more appealing to me. If the journey is orchestrated in such a way that it's going to get me on one metro or one bus and my friends are getting another bus, that becomes a lot less appealing. I appreciate there's a kind of a technological overhead there to doing it, but I think that's a major factor, organizing social travel.
Yeah, right. That's a really interesting point, and that's such good specific pointer that kind of leads me, unfortunately, to almost the end of our session, where we just jump into the top tips you might have for anyone running or planning a mobility as a service project. So we've only got 7 minutes left, but I thought if we could all share, if you had to give 1 or 2 pieces of advice to someone who's looking into mobility as a service on how to incorporate, on how to make it attractive for younger audiences, what would that be? Audrey, do you want to start?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there are a couple of critical pieces that have been highlighted through this conversation, which has been very interesting. I think the first one is thinking about how we make the experience both seamless and inclusive. So designing the technology so that it's a single journey planning experience and a single ticketing and payment experience that allows people to travel socially, to travel for the different needs, provides all of the sort of options so that people have those options available to them. And then the second piece, I think, is just reiterating the idea that public transit is the backbone of mobility as a service, and approaching MaaS as an ecosystem of pulling together all of the different pieces that provides the options that people want to travel. So as we think about how we provide options for moving away from single occupancy vehicles, not shaming or forcing or anything like that, but providing the options so that if people want to, it is inclusive of rural and suburban and transit deserts. So really thinking about how we develop the ecosystem that provides those options and uses public transit as the backbone, but then hangs all of the different options from demand responsive transport to flexible routes, shared vehicles, bike, pedestrian, and how that all hangs together as a single ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. And Romana, what are your top tips?
Yeah, I think I'm also in agreement with Audrey, but whatever I found from the research, that even though Innsbruck has a high quality transport, but there is a demand for MaaS anyway, because MaaS promises to bring the flexibility that public transport unfortunately have limited flexibility due to this fixed route schedule. So also young users, they have focused more that they need this mode flexibility. Due to their lifestyle, they need more flexibility. So maybe including or promoting that MaaS will bring flexibility to their life can make it more important to the young users. And also, I think one of the important things that Audrey said at the beginning of the rewarding system, I think young users or young person, they like to take action. They like to be a part of the community. They want to do something for the community. So if we can reward them, like if you use MaaS, maybe you can be the champion of the day by using all the green alternatives in one trip chain, something like that. that will make it more fun for young users to get attracted to MaaS and to to boast it to other users. Okay, today I was the champion, today I got this reward. So something that will encourage them in a fun way. I think that we can also consider when designing MaaS for specifically for this young users group.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that's very different to how we design for other audiences as well. It's very specific to this group, isn't it? Thank you. And Phil, what do you think? What are your top tips?
I think clearly the data suggests we need to get young people involved much earlier. As soon as we think of an idea, let's get them involved and ask them what they think, what they feel. Romana, I love the idea, make it far more playful for them. So, get them involved, observe people. And then also I'd say take a lot of those stakeholders on that journey with you. So they really understand, they're not just looking at data, numbers, they're really understanding what it is that people want from those services. And I think that's vitally important, putting those two user groups together. So that would be my early thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, definitely getting this group involved in the process as early as possible is what's important with any user group, isn't it? It's what any good design process would do, is bringing all those stakeholders in really early and not forgetting certain groups. And David, what do you think? Do you have any more tips?
I think it's so important. I'll say it again. I'll say what Phil's just said. If we're going to build inclusive mobility as a service, we need to include them. Ask them. They've got a voice. They know what they want. They can express it. So let's make sure we include children and young people and hear what they've got to say. I think the other thing I would add, and it's come up a couple of times, is about making mobility as a service resilient in a way that's appropriate for children. If I hear that the metro's not working or bus isn't working, I can hop in a car, I can book a taxi. It doesn't work in the same way for children and young people in that kind of way. They have different options and different constraints on what they're able to do and different pressures. So I think making sure that the service offering we give them is robust, particularly in times of disruption, needs careful thought, and I think it's really important.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, you're totally right. They obviously consume different transport modes in a different way, and they can't just spend £10 on a ride share or a black cab. So there have to be different solutions for them. But what I found really interesting is that social aspect of that, where mobility as a service can help, that sort of group travel, social travel, that would also deliver that safety that we spoke about and the environmental benefit. So it seems like that's where mobility as a service could really shine, and bring young people together to use this. It's really interesting. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our session. We could probably talk about this for another hour or two, at least I could. But yeah, thank you so much. That was a really great discussion. I think we picked a lot of really good highlights on what this audience needs, and also raise awareness on how we have to make sure we keep this audience in our thoughts and really involve them early on in the process, even though they don't pay tax yet, but they will soon. So thank you so much. And yeah, to the audience, thanks for joining. And if you follow the MaaS Alliance on LinkedIn or hook up with me on LinkedIn, we'll share the recording of this, and we'll also write a little summary as well. And we'll share the David's paper and Romana's research when that comes out next year as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day or night, wherever you are. Thanks. Bye.